Disasters, we should have learned by now, sometimes happen in seconds, or in some cases milliseconds. When situations go wrong, the room around you is violently shaking, the water is rapidly rising, or the plane is dropping out of the sky, you may only have seconds to make a decision. Which way to go? What actions to take? Who do you talk to first, and what do you say? In today's episode, all of the events took place within 90 minutes. In just 90 minutes, the platform went from fully operating to burnt, melted, and lying at the bottom of the sea. In the story we're about to investigate, those involved were on a burning oil platform in the middle of the sea, and the entire structure was melting around them. And sometimes it is just plain gut instinct that determines the difference between the quick and the dead.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end.
Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the Podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. My name is David Appleson. In this episode, we'll examine the worst oil platform disaster ever. It happened on the night of July 6, 1988, in the middle of the North Sea, with Scotland and the city of Aberdeen 125 miles to the southwest, and the nation of Norway to the northeast. 167 men died that night, including 2 rescue personnel, meaning most of the 226 men who lived and worked on the rig perished that evening. And they were all men. There were no women on Piper Alpha. The equipment losses to the operator, Occidental Petroleum, were estimated at more than £1.7 billion, and the cost to the British petroleum industry and the British economy in general was in the billions of pounds. It was a monumental disaster, and it was entirely caused by human error and oversight. Up until 1969, Britain had been mostly an importer of oil, but the discovery of large deposits in the North Sea changed all that. With drilling starting in the 1970s, by the 80s, the UK was a net exporter of oil. In 1973, in response to the Yom Kippur War in Israel, the major oil exporters at the time, the Arab-dominated OPEC nations, boycotted the United States and other Western nations. Unprepared, this led to a sense of panic in those countries as the price of oil and car fuel, whether you call it gas or petrol, also rose, quadrupling in price. In the U.S. led to gas rationing, long lines at service stations, calls for conservation and fuel economy, and a general decline in sales of large American cars, and a burst in the sales of economical Japanese cars. For the British petroleum industry, it meant something different. Oil production in the North Sea would become very profitable. When war and revolution in Iran spiked oil prices again in 1979, production in the North Sea was reaching its peak. The lesson learned from those two crises by the U.S., the U.K., and other nations was don't rely on a limited number of foreign sources for your oil supply, and do everything you can to develop domestic sources. Not only does it protect your economy from outside interruptions like the OPEC oil embargo, it is a great source of taxable income. And for Great Britain, it has been a very good source of taxable income indeed. The Piper oil field was discovered in 1973 as part of a frenzy of oil drilling in the North Sea following the 1969 discovery. Occidental Petroleum, a multinational joint venture, won the bid to become the operator of a series of platforms in that field. Wasting little time, construction of the platform, pipelines, and onshore support structures began that year. When it was completed, the Piper Alpha was the largest oil platform in the North Sea. It weighed more than 35,000 tons and operated in the icy cold waters of the North Sea near the Orkney Islands, where 27-meter-high waves and hurricane-force winds were not uncommon. Oil production started in 1976, extracting 250,000 barrels of oil per day, and would eventually produce as much as 300,000 barrels per day. Piper Alpha was an enormous boon to the UK petroleum industry. However, many experienced rouseabouts spoke of it nervously. There were a known number of fatalities and near misses prior to the disaster. Piper was synonymous with accident, said Jake Malloy, head of the offshore trade union OILC. People would say, "Piper? Oh, you don't go there. That place is ready to go," meaning collapse into the sea. Yet no one could have imagined the scale of the disaster that happened. Management was reluctant to talk about how volatile oil and gas can be. In those days, the offshore industry was an environment in which a frontiersman attitude flourished. It was an adventure, not a hazard. Piper brought home to everybody just what you were sitting on, Malloy said. If somebody had said to me that a platform could fall into the sea, I'd have laughed at them. But the reality is you're sitting on a bomb. It was a fixed platform, meaning that its foundation was located on the seafloor 474 feet below the water's surface. On top of the skeleton of the structure, 84 feet above the surface of the water, were located 4 modules, A, B, C, and D. These modules looked like very large shoe boxes stacked side by side. Each module was 15 by 46 meters. Module A contained the wellheads for 36 wells and was where the oil was brought up from the bottom of the sea. Module B contained the separation equipment that separated the oil from the seawater and the main oil export pumps used to pump oil into the main oil line. In Phase 1, the facility would pump only oil. In Phase 2, normal operation, gas would be directed to the gas conservation module located above Module B. Module C contained the gas compression equipment that converted the heavier gaseous products, methane, propane, and pentane, into liquids that were easier to transport. Inside the gas conservation module were the 2 condensate pumps, A and B, which were used to pump the converted or condensed gas to the main terminal at Orkney Islands. One pump was always operating while the other was on standby. Beneath Module B was a diving skid platform used by divers working beneath the water's surface. Module D contained the control room, the workshops, electrical power generation, and emergency diesel generators. Electricity for the facility was generated using gas processed at the platform. Living quarters were stacked atop Module D. A firewall, composed of 1-ton metal plates, separated each of the modules. The firewalls were designed to contain fires should the oil being pumped ignite. However, the firewalls were not designed to contain explosions. For safety reasons, the modules were organized so that the most dangerous operations were distant from the personnel areas. That way, if there was an accident such as a fire or explosion, the workers would not be in immediate danger and would have sufficient time to put out any fires or evacuate the platform if necessary. But soon natural gas deposits were discovered in the Piper field, and in 1980 the natural gas recovery module was added. This greatly increased the amount of gas flowing in and out of Piper Alpha, and placed the gas pipelines closer to the areas where the workers were located. Piper was also connected to other platforms by a series of pipelines including the Tartan platform, 12 miles away, pumping gas into Piper, the MCP platform, 34 miles away, receiving gas from Piper, the Claymore platform, 22 miles away, pumping gas into Piper, and the Flota oil processing terminal, 128 miles away on Orkney Island, where Piper pumped oil through a 30-inch diameter pipeline. In total, there were 4 pipelines filled with highly flammable oil or highly explosive gas or gas condensates that were being pumped around the clock by Piper. Like other offshore platforms, Piper Alpha used an automatic firefighting system driven by both diesel and electric pumps. The diesel pumps were designed to suck in large amounts of seawater for firefighting. These pumps had an automatic control to start them in case of fire, although they could not be remotely started from the control room in an emergency. However, the firefighting system was under manual control on the evening of July 6th because of work being done by Piper Alpha staff that evening, which required divers to be located near the caged intakes. To prevent any accidents around these intakes, the pumps were switched to manual control. From 1980 to 1988, Piper Alpha was operating in Phase 2 mode, that is, with the gas conversion module located next to the worker operations module so that it could produce both oil and gas. In the late 1980s, major construction, maintenance, and upgrade works were planned by Occidental, and by July 1988, the rig was well into major work activities, with 6 major projects identified. Piper went into Phase 1 operations, with the gas conservation module shut down. It was known that shutting down this module would lead to hydrate buildup that would clog the pipes. Liquid methanol was pumped in as an antifreeze. The planning and controls that were put in place were thought to be adequate. Therefore, Piper continued to export oil at just under 120,000 barrels per day, and it exported tartan gas at some 33 million standard cubic feet per day during this demanding period. Prior to July 6, 1988, a corporate decision was made to shut down condensate pump A in order to carry out work on a coupling component that was experiencing significant vibrations. Remember that condensate is gas that is pressurized and subjected to cold temperatures to turn it into a liquid for transport. That morning, Pump A's pressure safety valve was removed for routine maintenance as part of a 24-month preventative maintenance program. A permit to work, or PTW, was written for this operation. No maintenance was allowed without one. The open condensate pipe was temporarily sealed with a blind flange, or 1-inch thick steel disc plate. Subsequent investigations determined that most likely the flange was hand-tightened rather than tool-tightened, and because of this did not create a sufficient seal. As the routine maintenance work was not completed by the end of the day shift at 6 p.m., the engineer noted on a second permit to work that the job was incomplete, that Pump A was not ready and must not be switched on under any circumstances. The permit was removed from the job site to the control room, routine procedure for a normal work permit, whereas a suspended work permit like this one should have been filed in the safety office. The day engineer neglected to inform the night shift engineer of the missing safety valve because he was busy working on another assignment. The suspended permit would not be located again until after the disaster. At 9:45 p.m. that evening, a blockage was detected in the gas compression system pipeline, possibly due to a leak in the methanol antifreeze injection system put in place to prevent such blockages. Now, methane clathrate, a flammable form of ice, was forming in the pipes and blocking the system. This blockage caused the pump to stop, just like cholesterol building up in a person's arteries would cause that human pump known as the heart to stop. Pump B was no longer functioning, while Pump A had been taken down for maintenance. The Piper Alpha operation was about to go down, which would have necessitated a black start, or a start from basically zero, which is a very expensive and time-consuming procedure to perform. The night shift crew had only a few minutes to decide what to do. If they waited any longer, the whole system would have shut down. The do not start under any circumstances permit was located out of visible sight in the control room. However, the other work permit that stated the equipment overhaul had not yet started was found, and it was determined by the manager that it would be safe to start Pump A. Also, it should be noted that the missing safety valve was located several meters above the location of Pump A and was not clearly visible to the electrician examining the pump. At 9:55 p.m., a button was pushed starting Pump A. Natural gas was forced at 1,100 pounds per square inch pressure into the metal flange that was supposed to seal the pipeline in the absence of a safety valve. However, because the flange had been hand-tightened, it failed to hold back the flow of gas. Immediately, workers near Pump A could hear the sound of gas escaping from the pipelines. The gas leak was also detected by equipment aboard the platform. 6 alarms went off, the last one being the high-level gas alarm. Inside the control room, the safety light panel lit up like a Christmas tree. At this point, the gas was merely looking for a source of ignition. Before any of the workers could take preventative measures, the gas found a heat source, one never identified during the investigation, and produced an explosion. Charlie Miller, a witness on a nearby vessel, reported a flash of blue light followed by a blast of blue flames underneath Module C. About 45 kilograms of condensate vapor had exploded. Jeff Ballins, a production operator, was one of the first on Piper Alpha to realize something was wrong. A 40-year-old from the northeast of England, he had worked offshore for a decade. At 10 p.m., he was in the control room, working the last shift of a 2-week stint. Ballins had noticed that one of the condensate pumps had switched off, and he was in the process of trying to get started again when the gas alarms lit up on his instrument panel. Then the explosion came and knocked me about 20 feet, he said. Ballins hurt his right hip when he was thrown across the room and gashed his left thumb so badly that it started spouting blood. I was dazed and amazed by the magnitude of what had happened, he said. One minute we have a problem which is getting more and more severe, and the next minute the place is full of smoke. I'm injured. The fire panel and all of that end of the bulkhead have been smashed open, and the PA system isn't working. Following the explosion, Ballins wasted no time in pressing the emergency stop button, closing the huge valves in the sea lines, and ceasing all oil and gas extraction, bringing production to a grinding halt. That should have ended the event right there. The condensate explosion was large, about the size of an automobile gas tank exploding, but it was contained. No major injuries had been reported at this point. Shutting off the source of the oil and gas in the Piper's pumping lines should have prevented any further explosions. However, remember those firewall panels? They were installed to prevent an oil fire from spreading. That was when the platform was only pumping oil and not natural gas or gas condensate. Each of those panels was 2.5 by 1.5 meters, or about 5 by 8 feet. They were built to withstand flames and high temperatures. They were not built to withstand explosions. Rather than protecting the workers or the facility, the panels became fast-flying projectiles due to the explosion. One of those flying panels struck a condensate pipe in adjoining Module B, creating another explosion, also witnessed by crews on nearby vessels. A fire had started in Module B with red-orange flames and dirty black smoke, a telltale sign that its source was the oil, and this happened only seconds after the first explosion. The firefighting equipment was still on manual control. If it had been on automatic control, the alarms would have triggered its operation. Radio operator David Kinraid sent out a Mayday distress signal while the control room was abandoned due to the amount of damage it had sustained. Emergency procedures made no allowance for the destruction or abandonment of the control room. No attempt was made to order an evacuation. The public address system was knocked out. The electrical power and the backup generators were also out. Most of the facility's supervisors and managers also perished during the second explosion. There was little or no organization at this time. Each worker made his own decision about what appropriate actions to take. Ballins was trapped in a corner of the platform. Black smoke cut off his escape route in one direction, while flames prevented him from fleeing in the other direction. He knew he had no chance of reaching a lifeboat. Through sheer tenacity, Ballins made his way through the thick smoke and managed to escape Piper Alpha by climbing down a rope tied to a handrail from an 84-foot level. If that height wasn't far enough, he had to make the descent with his injured hand and a life jacket that kept snagging on the rope. Eventually he lowered himself into the sea and was picked up by a small rescue boat. Ballins was airlifted from the rescue trawler Silver Pit at around 8 a.m. the next morning, allowing him to watch all of Piper Alpha burn. It was like watching a disaster movie, he recalled. There were lads falling off ropes, lads jumping over the side. There were lads on fire. I remember someone bouncing off the bumper to stop the boats hitting the platform. Emergency procedures instructed personnel to make their way to the lifeboat stations, but the fire prevented them from doing so. Instead, many of the men moved to the fireproofed accommodation block beneath the helicopter deck to await further instructions. Wind, fire, and smoke prevented helicopter landings, and no further instructions were given, with smoke beginning to seep into the personnel block. The men in the living quarters were faced in the early stages with fire, smoke, and toxic fumes, as well as the risk of further explosions. Confusion and uncertainty reigned about what had just happened and what was to be done. Many of the men were uncertain whether to follow the standard training procedures they had been taught during numerous trainings or follow their own instincts in an environment the management had never prepared them for. Rescue facilities and craft were in sight, but due to the intense heat and smoke, they were unable to reach the platform. The Theros was an extremely well-equipped rescue ship built for handling such emergencies, but it was unable to fully use much of that equipment due to visibility conditions and the intensity of the heat. There were no life jackets, and those who jumped into the water had no protective clothing, only what they were wearing at the time. There was also an enveloping sense of isolation among the workers on the burning rig. They were truly lost at sea, with help from the mainland far away. "Pieces of burning debris were shooting off like meteors," said John Sayborn, master of the Silver Pit. "One piece shot straight towards the wheelhouse windows, and I was sure it was meant for me. I remember thinking, God, if I come out of this alive, I will never ever be frightened of dying again. It missed us by feet." Sayborn's other lasting memory of that night was seeing Eric Brianchon, a French technician, who was the most badly burned of all those rescued from the Piper. The Silver Pit's fast rescue craft discovered Brianchon clinging to a piece of wreckage. He was airlifted, but later succumbed to his injuries in the Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. "When he was being sent up to the helicopter, he had to pass within 2 feet of me," Sayborn said. "His face was indescribable, the agony, the shock. I had a camera on the bridge, and if I had the time or initiative to take a photo, it would surely have been a true picture that night." 37 of the 59 survivors were pulled from the water by the Silver Pit and its fast rescue craft. Thick columns of black smoke rising from the oil platform made helicopter landings impossible. They simply could not see the helideck, and even if they could, landing in such an environment would have presented its own dangers. Smoke, carbon dioxide, and carbon monoxide were now seeping into the accommodation block. As the situation in the accommodation block deteriorated, 2 workers on their own initiative donned protective gear and made their way to the diesel-fueled fire pumps in an attempt to manually start that equipment. Those 2 workers were never heard from again, and the fire continued to rage. Hitting the emergency stop buttons should have cut off the supply of fuel feeding the fire, but once the pumps were shut down, it caused a backflow or unequal pressure in the pipelines leading to the Claymore, Tartan, and main oil platforms. This resulted in forcing fresh fuel into the pipeworks on Piper, directly into the heart of the areas that were on fire. Both Tartan and Claymore platforms continued pumping gas until the second explosion because the managers at those facilities had no permission from the Occidental Control Center to shut down. The reason for this procedure was the huge cost of such a shutdown due to having to return to full operations using a black start. While those 2 pipelines continued to pump gas, the main oil line was still full of oil. Those gas pipelines, the 16-inch or 41 centimeter from the Claymore, and the 18-inch or 46 centimeter diameter line from the Tartan, were feeding lines to Piper Alpha. 2 years earlier, the Occidental management ordered a study, the results of which warned of the dangers of these gas lines. Because of their length and diameter, it would take several hours to reduce their pressure. With a constant supply of fuel, firefighting would be impossible. Although the management admitted how devastating a gas explosion would be, Claymore and Tartan were not switched off with the first emergency call. The next event involved another potential safety violation. Keeping an oil and gas platform running in the middle of the inhospitable North Sea required constant, around-the-clock maintenance. Crews worked 12-hour shifts for 2 weeks straight and then 2 weeks off. Sea divers were constantly checking, maintaining, and repairing the equipment that was located beneath the surface of the water. They had to traverse the metal grillwork of the dive skids in their bare feet. Because these metal decks were sharp and painful to walk over, they placed rubber mats over the areas where they needed to walk. As a result of the second explosion, oil was leaking out of the internal pipes or risers and collecting in a pool as it dripped onto some of these mats. In time, this pool of oil caught fire from the surrounding flames. The burning pool of oil created an intense source of heat directly below a 90-degree bend in one of the tartan gas risers, which was filled with natural gas under high pressure due to the back pressure. That pipe became superheated. Finally, it burst, releasing 15 to 30 tons of high-pressure gas every second, which immediately ignited, causing an enormous explosion. There would be no recovery from that explosion. Piper Alpha was doomed to collapse. At 10:30 p.m., the Theros, a firefighting, rescue, and accommodation vessel, drew alongside the burning platform. The Theros used its water cannon where it could, but it was restricted because the cannon was so powerful it would injure or kill anyone hit by the water. Desperate, many workers fled the fireproof living quarters below the helideck and jumped into the sea. Few survived. If the long fall didn't kill them, they succumbed to hypothermia from the icy cold waters. Around 100 men were gathered in the canteen area when the first explosion took place. The emergency lighting went off and the room was dark except for the glow from fires licking the windows. One survivor described the canteen as being like a pot sitting on top of a gas stove. It was so hot that people cooled themselves with water from the fish tanks or squeezed tomatoes over their skin. When smoke began to smother the room, men were forced to crawl along the floor, gasping at an inch or two of clean air. They had wrapped wet towels around their faces as protective masks. At 10:50 p.m., the MCP-01 gas line, that is the 30-inch gas line that connected Piper Alpha to the refinery on Orkney Island, ruptured. Millions of cubic feet of gas escaped from the pipeline, further feeding the conflagration, increasing the intensity of the fire. Flames shot over 300 feet into the air, and rescuers and those they rescued on rubber rafts more than 100 yards away were blasted by the heat, killing 6 Piper Alpha workers and 2 crew from the rescue boat. The Theros was driven off, unable to fight the fire and unable to rescue any other workers. The metal structure of the platform began to melt from the intense heat, compromising the structural integrity of the platform. It is similar to the way the World Trade Center towers lost their structural integrity when the passenger airplane fuel tanks exploded within their metal frames. Some workers were so desperate at this point that they jumped the 175 feet or 50 meters into the sea from the platform of the helideck. At 11:18 p.m., the third line, the Claymore gas line, ruptured, adding more gas to the fire. More fuel was surely overkill by this point, and it only hastened the destruction of the platform. 20 minutes later, the Theros contacted the captain of the Nimrod, Rescue 01, to appraise him of the situation. A standby vessel had picked up 25 casualties, including 3 with serious burns. Theros requested the evacuation of its non-essential personnel to make room for incoming casualties. The vessel, Rescue 138, requested to evacuate 12 non-essential personnel from Theros to transfer to the vessel Ocean Victory before returning to the Piper Alpha with paramedics. At 10 minutes to midnight, the structural integrity of the platform failed as its massive steel girders melted and collapsed, unable to bear the weight they were supporting. All of the modules slipped off the oil platform like a child's building blocks. The living quarters and canteen, with all those who had taken shelter there, fell into the water, sinking to the seabed floor. Those who hadn't been overwhelmed by flame and smoke or the tremendous drop drowned in the depths of the waters. Within minutes, the entire structure had collapsed and disappeared, leaving only Module A, the oil drilling portion of the structure, still standing. The fire reached over 700 degrees Celsius or 1300 Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt hard hats onto the heads of the men wearing them, while debris was thrown 800 meters into the air. There were only 59 survivors. A third of these made their escape from the platform within 20 minutes of the first explosion. Many scaled down the 10-story-long rope dangling from the hand railing before taking a 20-foot plunge into the sea. Of the 5 men who jumped from the helideck, 175 feet above the sea, 3 died on impact, their rib cages fracturing and damaging their lungs, heart, and other vital organs. There were also many heroes that night, as rescue teams managed to save a lucky few from the platform. None saved more than the vessel the Sandpit, which managed to bring 37 people to safety. Coxswain James Clark later received the George Medal, an award given by the United Kingdom for acts of civilian bravery. Others awarded the George Medal were Charles Haffey, Andrew Kilo, and James McNeil. It took 3 weeks for the blazing remains of the platform to be extinguished. Red Adair, the famous oil rig firefighter, led a team that, despite reported conditions of 80-mile-per-hour or 130-kilometer-per-hour winds and 70-foot or 20-meter waves, managed to get the fire under control. Adair would later go on to control the fires the Iraqi army left burning in Kuwait during the Persian Gulf War in 1991. The living quarters, containing the canteen, where about 100 victims had taken refuge, was recovered in late 1988 from the seabed, and the bodies of 87 men were found inside. 30 bodies were never recovered. In November of 1988, the UK established the Cullen Inquiry, chaired by the Scottish judge Lord William Cullen, to determine the cause of the disaster. After 180 days of proceedings, Cullen and the other inquiry members released their report, the Public Inquiry into the Piper Alpha Disaster, commonly called the Cullen Report, in November 1990. Their report identified 106 findings, and I will summarize the major ones. The subsequent investigation was hindered by a lack of physical evidence owing to most of it being destroyed in the conflagration. However, based upon eyewitness accounts, it was concluded that most likely a release of light hydrocarbon, in other words condensate, occurred when a pump was restarted after maintenance. The maintenance personnel starting the pump were unaware that a relief valve in the pump discharge line had also been removed for service, and a blank had been loosely installed in its place on the piping flange, which was not readily visible from the pump vicinity. Upon restart of the pump, this flange leaked, producing a flammable hydrocarbon cloud, which subsequently found an unidentified ignition source. The Piper Alpha platform was at the hub of a network of platforms interconnected by oil and gas pipelines. The initial explosion ruptured oil lines on Piper Alpha, and the leaks were fed by the still pressurized inter-platform pipelines. Managers on other platforms, aware of a problem on Piper Alpha, but not its severity, assumed that they would be instructed to shut down their operations if needed. However, the explosion had interrupted communications from Piper Alpha, and considerable intervals, from 30 to 60 minutes, passed before these other platforms were eventually shut down. A series of follow-on explosions occurred as the fires on the platform weakened natural gas riser pipelines on Piper Alpha. The intensity of the fires prevented rescue efforts either by helicopter or by ship. At the height of the event, natural gas was being burned on Piper Alpha at a rate equivalent to the entire United Kingdom natural gas consumption rate. Many of the platform crew retreated to the crew accommodation module as they had been trained to await evacuation. No organized attempt was made to retreat from the accommodation module, even though it became increasingly apparent that the conditions in the module were becoming untenable. 81 personnel died from smoke inhalation in the crew quarters, awaiting further instructions that never came. Survivors found ways, on their own initiative, to get to the water, some jumping to the sea from considerable heights on the platform. 2 separate work permits had been issued for the condensate pump, one for the pump repair and one for testing the relief valve. The relief valve job had not been completed by the end of the shift, and rather than working overtime to complete it, it was decided to terminate the permit for that day and continue on the next. The craft supervisor suspended the permit and returned it to the control room without notifying operations staff of the job status. During shift turnover, the status of the pump work was addressed, but no mention was made of the relief valve work, and there was no mention of it in the control room or maintenance logs. Continuing problems with the adequacy of shift turnovers and log entries were a problem known to some. One staff member said, "It was a surprise when you found out some things which were going on." When the online condensate pump failed later in the shift, creating an imperative to start the spare to enable continued production, control room personnel were only aware of the pump repair work permit and proceeded to have the pump returned to service. The permit to work, or PTW system, was often not implemented according to procedure, or to quote, the procedure was knowingly and flagrantly disregarded. For example, 1. Omissions were common. Crucial information was left unreported. 2. Operations representatives often did not inspect the job site before suspending the permit at the end of the shift, or closing the permit indicating the work had been completed. And 3. Craft supervisors often left permits on the control room desk at the end of a shift, rather than personally returning them to the responsible operations representative as required by the procedure. Although the PTW system was monitored by the lead safety operator, no indications of problems were reported, and management did not independently review the operation of the system. Based upon an absence of information to the contrary, management assumed that they knew that things were going all right. It is noted that a senior maintenance technician had voiced his concerns about the PTW system at a meeting at corporate headquarters earlier in the year. In addition, the company had entered a guilty plea in a civil legal proceeding involving a worker fatality caused in part by a PTW system problem. However, no substantive improvements in the PTW system resulted. The diesel-powered fire pumps had been placed in manual control mode due to the presence of divers in the water around the platform. This practice was more conservative than company policies, and a 1983 fire protection audit report had recommended that this practice be discontinued. Placing the pumps in manual meant that personnel needed to reach the pumps in order to start them after the explosion. However, conditions prevented this, and as a result, the Piper Alpha deluge system was unavailable. Had firewater been available, its efficacy might have been limited. Distribution piping, including that in the platform module, where the fires were most severe, was badly corroded, and pluggage of sprinkler heads was a known problem dating back to 1984. Various fixes had been attempted, and a project to replace the fire protection piping had been initiated, but work was lagging behind schedule. Tests in May 1988 revealed that approximately 50% of the sprinkler heads in the subject module were plugged. To put the previous two observations in perspective, the structural steel on Piper Alpha had no fireproofing, and it was known, at least to management, that structural integrity could be lost within 10 to 15 minutes if a fire was fed from a large pressurized hydrocarbon inventory. Evacuation drills were not conducted weekly as required. No full-scale shutdown drill had been conducted in the 3 years prior to the explosion. Platform managers had not been trained on their response to such an emergency on another platform, although not all of the connected platforms were owned by Occidental. Approximately 1 year before the explosion, company management were cautioned in an engineering report that a large fire from escaping gas could pose serious concerns with respect to the safe evacuation of the platform. However, Piper management discounted the likelihood of such an event, citing existing protective systems. In fact, the gas risers upstream of the emergency isolation valves on Piper Alpha were not protected against fire exposure, and because of the diameter and length of the interplatform gas lines, several days would be required to depressurize the pipelines in the event of a breach. It was the failure of these lines that destroyed Piper Alpha and prevented its evacuation. The report provided critical commentary on what was judged to be inadequate management oversight and follow-up on each of the issues mentioned in the report. Because there was still an enormous amount of oil remaining in the Piper field, the oil industry wasted no time in constructing a second platform to replace Alpha, which was called Bravo. Occidental Petroleum, under the name ELF Enterprise Caledonia, completed construction of the rig just 4 years after the destruction of Alpha, with production commencing in 1993. A number of lessons had been learned in regards to Alpha that were applied to Bravo. Blast walls were added to go along with the firewalls so that the platform was prepared for oil fires and gas explosions. The living quarters, which had always been designated as the area of temporary refuge, were built to better withstand fires and explosions. HVAC systems were added with automatic fire dampers to prevent the ingress of smoke and gas. The control center and radio room were placed far away from the hazardous modules, providing better protection to vital emergency personnel. The power supply to the public address system and radio room were designed with better protection. Emergency shutdown valves were added to the risers and were placed in enclosures to protect against fire and blast. Collector hubs were added to the pipelines to cut down on the amount of stored fuel in between platforms and refineries. The fire pumps were built with spatial separation and remote start mechanisms, reducing the chance that all the pumps would be knocked out in an explosion and allowing personnel to start the pumps from a safe distance if necessary. The extra precautions seemed to have worked. Bravo experienced a number of gas leaks and at least one explosion in 1994. However, there were no fatalities and no injuries. One of the most difficult problems for those who survived the disaster on Piper Alpha was survivor's guilt. The ratio of fatalities to survivors was nearly 3-to-1. It left many of the survivors wondering, why me? Why did I survive and not my friend? Electrician Bob Ballantyne had great difficulty dealing with his memories from that night. July 6, 1988 had started just like any other work evening. I had been to the recreation room, and Charlie McLaughlin had been to the movies the night the Piper blew. When we came back down to see what was happening, we had seen people getting their wetsuits out and getting their wetsuits on, and we thought, this must be pretty serious, because people are coming in with their wetsuits on. So we went back to the cabin, and there was Ian, folding socks, and he had pulled out his drawer, and he was fixing his underwear, and he was fixing his socks, and he was putting them back in the drawer. I said, Ian, don't worry about it. We're leaving the platform. And I could see him fixing his socks, putting the 2 socks in one and putting his underwear away. And really, I'm thinking, don't do this. You've not got time. In saying this, I was silly enough. I took a book with me, and I had reading glasses at that time, and I took them with me. And I suppose I was as silly as him because I thought, Charlie's wanting to go for a drink. The other guy's putting his socks away, and I'm wanting to go for a read. So between the 3 of us, we weren't too glib. But I think these things also help you to reduce it to an element you can understand. There was confusion in the canteen. Bob was asked his name by emergency personnel and told his lifeboat assignment twice at a point when time was of the essence. No one could tell him if the platform was actually going to be evacuated. Many of the crew made the wrong decision at that time. Bob said, I don't criticize the lads whatsoever who went back inside the accommodation, who thought it was safer, who thought they would get saved by a helicopter. Those Occidental training manuals, safety manuals, I just never bought into that at any time. I'm not saying that in hindsight. I used to think about it and go like that, you've got to be joking that they can get a helicopter out here if these things go up or if I have an accident. The number that was left, we split up to look for ways off the platform. And I'm trying to get to D sector because this is where most of us were. We tried the west side, Ian Galanders and myself, and another lad who I don't know. We tried the west side, and the reason was that if you found a way, you would come back to a central point and tell everyone about it. Eventually, Ballantyne made the right decision, but because of the urgency of the moment, he was unable to explain his rationale to the others. We went to the production level. The lads went to the west side of the platform, which was quite right, because the rescue ship Theros was lying there. But I never went there. For want of a better word, I was absolutely terrified. The metal was melting. The blowout preventers, were just melting. It was like a surrealist painting, like one of those Salvador Dali's with the melting watch. It looked like a nightmare. When I looked that way, I just decided not to go. Others did, and none of them survived it all. None of them did. Charlie and Ian, who I shared a cabin with, I'd known Charlie for years. Charlie came back and said to me, "Come on this way, wee man." And I said to myself, "No, I don't trust this." And I never went, and I think it's only, again, I have described it before, it's one of those things like deja vu, or I could look at myself from above, and I could see myself making my way through, and it only happened momentarily, and I knew that I should make my way through to the east side of the platform. Momentarily, I saw myself in the dream, because when you are in a dream, you see yourself as well as if you were looking in. And I was looking in as if it was happening, but it was enough for me to say, no, I shouldn't go. I shouldn't go to the west side of the platform. I still to this day, I have a terrible guilt feeling about it. I was told not to use the word desertion, but it keeps coming up in my vocabulary. It keeps coming up in my thinking. It keeps coming up in my psyche that somehow I deserted them. Ian Letham was a driver on one of the rescue craft aboard the Theros. When the MCP gas line exploded at 10:50, Letham felt a whoosh of hot air before being thrown off the rescue craft. The flames were so intense his ears blistered. 2 of the rescue workers on that craft, as well as 6 workers retrieved from the platform, died in the flames of that blast. Letham was the only one who survived. After that, he said he could no longer take life lightly. He became serious about everything, and he missed his former self. He wanted to go back to not being so serious and focused on every detail. It isn't a topic we discuss much, but I'm certain for every disaster we've examined in this podcast, there must be a tremendous guilt and PTSD issues for those who survive, regardless of when it happened or what were the circumstances. Thank you for joining me for the Podcast of Doom. Please feel free to comment regarding your thoughts by emailing me at podcastofdoom@aol.com or visit me at www.thepodcastofdoom.com. I've received a lot of great episode suggestions, and I want all the listeners to know that I'm making great use of those suggestions. Again, thank you very much for your input. In fact, today's episode was a listener suggestion brought to us by listener SL. I didn't know about Piper Alpha until someone suggested it. What I would really like now is questions. I would like to devote some significant time to your questions. I'm sure you must have some, and I will do my best to supply you with answers. So again, you can email me those questions at podcastofdoom@aol.com or go to the comments section of the website at www.thepodcastofdoom.com. Next time, we will examine the nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl as we stick with the theme of industrial disasters. It was the worst nuclear accident the world has ever witnessed, and we will look at how it was allowed to happen. Until next time, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.